Thank you, Sam. And hello, everyone. Yes, it's very early here on Wednesday morning in Australia after 1:30 a.m. So please excuse me if I fade a little. So I want to take a little bit of a different approach to the previous speakers, but thank them for all setting the scene in terms of what regulations are out there across the world. And that sort of, as I said, it sort of gives us a good base for what I'm going to say. I want to have a look at a review that we did across our standards in Australia and New Zealand for food packaging chemicals, and by doing this illustrate the regulations that we have in place, but the rationale for the system that we actually have. So my outline today is just a quick look at food standards Australia and New Zealand, and the Australian and New Zealand Food Standards Code, because the code provides the basis of requirements for substances added to food across Australia and New Zealand. Look at the requirements around food packaging chemicals that may migrate into food. Some of the surveys and risk assessment work that we did to support this review around food packaging chemicals and the risk management approach that we actually adopted. FSANZ is an Australian statutory agency within the health portfolio, but it does set standards across both Australia and New Zealand for certain areas. But of course, one of those areas is substances that can be added to food. So that is one area, and I'll explain that in a little bit more detail. The main function of FSANZ is to develop and administer the Australian and New Zealand Food Standards Code, and it is a legislative instrument that is given effect by state and territory and New Zealand laws. So FSANZ itself has no responsibility for enforcement. That lies with the states and territories, or if you're in Canada, provinces, and they also have their own food acts, which are quite harmonised across those states and territories that essentially give them the power of enforcement. So the Australian New Zealand Food Standards Code is split up into what we call chapters. And if we're talking about substances, all sorts of substances, or requirements for particular things in foods, a la limits, whether they be additives, food processing aids, contaminants, microbiological, it's in Chapter 1, and we call that vertical standard across all foods. We have Chapter 2 that has specific standards for particular foods, and then we have other chapters that deal with more of food safety practices and standards at the primary production level. Now, Chapters 1 and 2 apply to both Australia and New Zealand. So that's one of the aspects I wanted to point out. And certainly in this area of chemicals and contaminants that may arise from food packaging, that's the code covers both Australia and New Zealand. So if we're looking at chemicals migrating from food packaging, I suppose the risk management approaches that we may have, firstly, and we've seen that across the US, EU and Canada that there are various levels established for contaminants. Also, you know, there are migration levels from particular packaging materials. Now, I want to point out that FSANZ only can establish levels in the food. We don't govern packaging materials per se. Other agencies are involved in that. So yeah, that is not our role. So we would be only looking at levels in the actual food. And I think it's also important to point out that we really only look at a maximum level where it serves an effective risk management function. and a significant contribution to the total dietary exposure. For that reason, and where there is a public health, risk of that substance if over a particular level, and for that reason, we only traditionally had very few mLs in Food Standards Code relating to chemicals arising from food packaging. It's also important to note that within Food Acts across Australia, there are general and quite strong provisions that all food must be safe and suitable. And it is, as Mark mentioned, across Canada as well, it is the responsibility of industry to ensure the safety of their foods at all levels. As I said, there is the alternative to establish mLs for packaging material and not the food, but that's not under FSANZ's purview. I think importantly, it's also, we have to look at, I suppose, regulation across a broad lens. We're not just talking about standards and limits. We're talking about other measures in terms of information, codes of practice. Mark talked about guidance as well in Canada, and also self-regulation by industry through their standards and also their quality assurance processes. So it's this holistic look at what we had in place across Australia and New Zealand that we wanted to learn more about, and to determine whether we needed to actually establish more standards along the lines of the EU and the US, or whether the system is actually operating cohesively and there are sufficient controls and assurances in place. Some of the few standards that are in the Food Standards Code, and Mark mentioned the issue of polyvinyl chloride and the migration of vinyl chloride, probable human carcinogen, but also acrylonitrile that can be found in a range of plastics. There are limits there. Those limits are set at the limit of detection. And traditionally, we also had limits for tin from canned foods, which have shown to have public health effects over the years. So there's maximum levels there. I think what we also heard from Dr. Dominic early on is the big challenge around food packaging chemicals. Firstly, from a risk assessment point of view, the multitude of chemicals, I suppose the expansion of the use, and Mark talked about new uses of particular substances in food packaging. So the expansion of the use of I suppose, known chemicals, but also chemicals with unknown properties and not always having a good understanding of their toxicology. And obviously we have that complexity of there being so many food packaging materials, chemicals used across, many facets of the industry, production, bulk packaging, adhesives, etc., printing inks. So very complex, as was pointed out early on. And how do we assess the risk that may arise from such, a multitude of chemicals, firstly for which we may know some properties and toxicology, but then the unknown. So it's certainly a challenge. And the question we wanted to really ask was, are the current risk management measures managing the risk? We did know, we had been lobbied for quite some years from some parts of the industry that perhaps the smaller end of industry wasn't managing the risks of food packaging chemicals well. We also heard from Dr. Demenek around the challenges of recycled materials, contamination, and also what was the knowledge of industry as a whole around chemicals migrating from packaging, and therefore what were their risk management practices. So the big questions we were asking was, what was the potential public health and safety risk arising from food packaging? What were the risk management measures in place? And as I explained, not only just the mandatory standards, but right across industry in terms of all the assurances that were in place. And were these regulations and practices adequate? So was there, I suppose, residual risk in the system? This was the ultimate question we were asking. And did we have to put in place further measures to address that potential residual risk? So there were various activities undertaken, and there's a lot actually in this slide in terms of work, and this was undertaken over a number of years, this project and the review of standards and risk management for food packaging chemicals. We had an industry advisory group. There were various levels of consultation. There are a range of surveys undertaken with industry in terms of their practices, questionnaires put to various levels of industry, both small and large, to glean what their practices were and their knowledge of this area was. We undertook surveys of our own in terms of food packaging chemicals, and obviously we looked at overseas requirements in terms of regulations. So for some chemicals, we looked at that we had traditionally seen when we undertook surveys. You can do the classical, risk assessment where you have got a good database and you may have health-based guidance values, and you can actually characterise that risk. From our surveys, we had some indication of the likely exposure assessment in terms of the combination of the concentration data, food consumption data that we have in our databases, and therefore we could estimate the dietary exposure and compare that to health-based guidance values. So that was done with key chemicals that I'll touch upon also in a minute or two. I suppose you do have to have your data on consumption of specific foods and the level of the chemicals in those foods when you're undertaking your exposure assessments. We heard earlier that it can be difficult to get an estimate of dietary assessments. I suppose our assumptions were that migration levels are usually low. We tend to use screening approaches based on worst case exposure scenarios to get an indication of risk characterisation initially. And that involves using maximum detected concentration when there are non-detects as well. So that gives you a very conservative approach to dietary exposure. But of course, if that's not adequate and if it indicates a potential problem, then there's refinement that can be done with the dietary exposure assessment, further testing and refining the dietary exposure assessment. Mark also talked about the technique of threshold of toxicological concern, looking at establishing human exposure threshold values for groups of chemicals. So looking at chemical structures and the known toxicity of chemicals which share those similar structural characteristics. And so you can allocate various thresholds depending on those structure and functional groups. And we did some of this work as well. We obviously leant heavily on the work of the US and the Europeans. We didn't reinvent the wheel here, but we utilised the approaches that, as Mark said, have been utilised through GFoRSS and FSA and also the US to look at some of the groups of chemicals in a range of packaging. So some of the surveys that we utilised for our work in this review are shown here across Australia and New Zealand. We had some early survey work done on bisphenol A, where there obviously were detections. You'd be worried if you didn't get detections, but no safety concerns based on risk assessment. We also looked at phthalates and perfluorinated compounds and a range of other chemicals in a range of packaged materials such as glass, paper, plastic, and cans. Did not see safety concerns there. Later on, through our total diet survey work, we looked again at a range of chemicals, including phthalates and printing ink chemicals. Saw some potential issue with the phthalates and undertook to undertake some more survey work there, additional foods, additional concentration work, and later showed through that additional work that there probably weren't concerns. This was followed up in 2018. New Zealand also undertook some work in 2017. 2018, we also looked at mineral oil hydrocarbons and concluded that there were no safety concerns. So the conclusion of this work around food contact materials were, from the Australian-New Zealand perspective, certainly, was that probably exposures from food packaging were low and unlikely to pose new public health and safety concerns. We did see from the industry, from an overall perspective, there were a lot of control measures in place. And for example, a lot of the large industry that were manufacturing packaging in Australia and the large importers that were bringing packaging materials into Australia were complying with predominantly EU regulations anyway. And they also had quality assurance processes around their production and processing equivalent to what was described for the EU. Our analytical surveys of targeted chemicals did not show a risk. The area of concern was the small to medium enterprises that showed not as a good knowledge of the issue as the larger industries, which in many ways you'd come to expect. But the bottom line in terms of action here was that the review concluded that there was no need to set more specific limits at this stage, but there was a need to look at greater guidance and information for industry on the safety issues around food packaging and to clearly describe the obligation on food businesses to use safe packaging materials and to source safe packaging materials. So I'm going to end there. Thank you, Sam.